So there's a brand new report out over at the Gray Zone, and it's a big one. Kit Klarenberg has uncovered internal files showing how the British government has been running a quiet but very aggressive censorship machine. This isn't some fly-by-night operation. It's called the old D-Notice system, which was now been rebranded as the DSMA. And according to these documents, they're not just offering guidance to journalists. Hey, we think you should cover this story or maybe take this angle on it. They're actively shaping and sometimes totally killing stories altogether. So what really jumped out to me, though, is that they brag about a 90+% success rate going into newsrooms and getting them to fall in line. And if you don't, well, guess what? Some independent news outlets were actually labeled extremist for refusing to play ball. So they're extremists. It's wild. So I wanted to bring Kit Klarenberg on from the Gray Zone to walk us through what he and his co-author found in this, how the system actually works behind the scenes, and what it means for press freedom going forward. Does press freedom even exist in the UK anymore at all? Here is, I guess, extremist journalist Kit Klarenberg, who joins us now. Kit, great to see you again. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on, Clayton. You forgot my designation as a dangerous individual, which Meta bestowed upon me to justify banning people who share my work on Facebook. Yeah, I mean, this is, if I do say so myself, this is pretty big. The DSMA committee, which is the acronym DSMA, meaning Defense Security Media Advisory Committee. It operates in plain sight, but is also kind of concealed from public view because no journalist, quote unquote, ever talks about this, and with good reason, because it is an absolutely extraordinary and unique in the world system of press censorship and suppression, which is in theory completely voluntary. So the committee issues what are known as D notices, or they write to journalists and editors if they think a story might be published or is going to be published that contains sensitive information the British state doesn't want in the public domain. And they're very polite, very. It's all very British and gentlemanly and dishonest. And they say, oh well, could you please not include this detail, or could you just avoid this story? And I've been writing about the DSMA committee for a number of years. And it's often quite difficult to get audiences to wrap their heads around this, because yes, it seems like a contradiction in terms. A voluntary system that has a 90% success rate in suppressing inconvenient truths and facts and perspectives, even when information is in the public domain. But it's all there in this declassified trove that myself and my co-author William Evans, we spent many months battling Australian authorities to get these documents via freedom of information, because the DSMA committee is ostensibly, quote unquote, independent, even though its headquarters is in the Ministry of Defence offices. It is wholly funded by the British Ministry of Defence, and all of its apparatchiks are government employees. By claiming they're independent, it means the DSMA is completely immune from FOI requests. But what a few years back, the Australian government explored the idea of adopting the D-Notice system itself. And they had extensive consultations with the committee on its practicalities, how it functions, and its potential applicability to Australia's media ecosystem. And so they were forced, after much tussling, to hand over these very revealing documents, which include an internal review of the DSMA system that was commissioned in the wake of Edward Snowden's disclosures. They contain communications between the DSMA committee and Australian government officials, Australian the Australians had a large number of questions about how the system worked, and it's all extremely revealing, and it offers unique insight into this, uniquely British form of press censorship, which is completely voluntary. It's like elective self-subjugation by mainstream reporters, because they're not legally obliged to follow DSMA quote unquote or they're not duty bound to abide by a D notice saying don't report on this particular topic. But yes, as you mentioned in the introduction, it has a 90% success rate, and in discussions with the Australian government, committee officials boasted that almost never, like very, very, very rarely, news outlets report on things that the DSMA doesn't want them to report on, the level of involvement in the DSMA of the DSMA committee in how the British media reports on national security is really quite extraordinary. And there are all these references to how well journalists send us their stories in advance of publication, and we actually authored by the British Ministry of Defence.
Could you repeat? You broke up there that last few sentences. You said that basically it's like you broke up. You said something about like the British Ministry of Defence is essentially like writing news articles in a way. Can you just go back like a few sentences?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. So, it creates a situation whereby voluntarily mainstream journalists are submitting their work to the Ministry of Defence in advance of publication, and the Ministry of Defence is editing and amending their work, and it results in the vast proportion, if not, the universal total of British media reporting on matters of quote unquote national security being written by the Ministry of Defence. Now, of course, the very concept and phrase national security is extraordinarily broad, and it means whatever the British state wants it to mean. And what's quite interesting is that in these classified documents, there is a lengthy table listing various stories that were subject to DSMA interest between early 2011 and late 2014. It is left to our imaginations what stories the DSMA committee has pounced on and suppressed and distorted since then. But on top of topics such as in 2012, the DSMA was very interested in media reporting on SAS, which is to say British Special Forces involvement in Syria, that was widely rumoured at the time, but no substantive reporting emerged on it, no doubt due to DSMA intervention. But there's all sorts of other topics as well, such as the 2011 London riots, MPs visiting brothels, and high-level corruption, which the DSMA also saw fit to make interventions on. So, it's pretty much anything the British state doesn't want in the public domain is open to DSMA editing, DSMA suppression. The list goes on. Something that really jumped out to me going over this was in 2013, the DSMA issued advice on dozens of times in relation to British forces and British intelligence in relation to the death of Princess Diana in August 1997. It's just like, quite what they were seeking to suppress and quite what wasn't published as a result isn't clear. But it's evident that, yes, the DSMA has grand designs, and there's an assumption that, we can tell journalists what to report on and not report on, and indeed how to report on it, covering a vast amount of subject areas.
You talk about this 90% success rate that they're boasting about. So how exactly do they measure that? Like, what does success actually mean to them? Does it mean the suppression of particular facts in a story? They don't want them talking about members of parliament going to brothels. They want to keep, where do they have some sort of a scale that they're saying we have a 90% success rate because we've got the BBC to not do this? Can you maybe walk through some of the mechanics of that? And by the way, who's involved in this? So we're talking state-run media, essentially, the BBC and others?
Yeah, sure. In regards to the latter, the DSMA committee, every major newspaper and TV news broadcaster is a member of this and is getting directions from them. But yeah, as I say, it's run by the Ministry of Defence. It brings together representatives of the security services, government agencies, of MI5, MI6, the military, and it creates a kind of client relationship between powerful individuals and organizations and journalists who are, in theory, meant to hold them to account. And the DSMA boasts about how it holds annual tours of the offices of GCHQ and MI5 and MI6 for mainstream reporters, which of course means that it is extremely unlikely that those reporters are going to write negatively about their newfound friends in the British deep state. And there's another thing that jumped out to me as well, which is that public minutes of DSMA committee meetings, they frequently refer to apologies having been received from journalists. Now, presumably these wayward reporters neglected to consult the DSMA before publishing a certain story, or they let particular information seep into the public domain that the committee wasn't happy about. And I cite in the piece, there is a kind of veteran journalist who's now unemployable by token of being a bit of a dissident, called Ian Cobain. He wrote this excellent book in 2016 called The History Thieves, which refers to how British reporters voluntarily submit between 80 to 90% of stories they think could be of interest to the committee for official examination before publication. So I suppose their 90% success rate is, well, in 90% of cases when we have asked journalists not to report particular facts or to ignore particular stories, they have acquiesced, again, completely voluntarily. A recent example of this is in late 2023, the DSMA committee issued notice saying that they didn't want stories about British special forces involvement in quote-unquote counter-terrorism operations in Gaza to enter the public domain. Now, again, we don't have to think very hard about what those kind of operations might entail in the Gazan context. This is it is effectively referencing that how the SAS is directly involved.
Yeah, just to be clear on that. So this was a major concern to them. They didn't want the British people to know that British special forces were in Gaza. And, your mind could run wild as to what those operations would look like, aiding and abetting the Israelis to carry out attacks on quote unquote Hamas or otherwise, right? So they didn't want the British people to know that.
Yeah, indeed, and lo and behold, this topic has completely vanished from any consideration in the mainstream media. Declassified UK, which is named in the declassified documents as an example of a quote unquote extreme publication. They have done an enormous amount of work on how British military and intelligence flights are routinely flown to Israel from nearby Cyprus, where Britain has this massive military and intelligence base. And yeah, they don't want that in the public domain, even though it is public information. You can see on I think it's called Skyscanner. There is a website which shows the path of flight. This is publicly accessible information, and yet the British media will effectively kowtow to the diktats of the DSMA and simply not mention this. It's a really quite extraordinary fudge, and yes, a devastatingly successful one. Now, I might add as well that the references to the Classified UK, I mean, this is an independent publication, which it does do some fantastic work. The DSMA cites examples of declassified reporting on topics which, in theory, don't breach DSMA rules, but they're still regarded as problematic nonetheless. And I think, yes, it speaks to the fact that the DSMA does have kind of global ambitions, and it seeks to act well beyond its stated purview. There are references to how, well, by token of our interventions, the international media doesn't report on British national security matters. So, they not only want to censor what the British media is saying, but what overseas publications report on as well.
Well, that's what I was just about to ask you. I wanted to ask you maybe to clarify a little bit here who these independent outlets are that are being labeled extremists. So you mentioned UK Declassified, so they're saying we're going to report this information anyway. They're labeled as extremists. Who else is labeled as an extremist? Because I'd like to follow those people. And then on top of that, yeah, I was just about to ask you the U.S. involvement in this, and U.S. journalists or other countries, but specifically the United States. Are United States journalists reached out to by the British government and also asked not to report on these particular things?
Well, I mean, that's certainly the direction the DSMA wants to push in, and I think that what's notable is, and I touched on this in the piece. At the risk of self-promotion, I urge all your viewers to check it out. Is that the DSMA for a very long time has viewed social media as a real problem, and a growing one as well, because people can all over the world can post sensitive information that the British government doesn't want in the public domain. The DSMA committee is very keen to get hooks into major social media platforms to try and dictate to them what's allowed and what isn't. On their own networks, which is pretty extraordinary, and I mean, I think it speaks to an enormous sense of kind of entitlement. I mean, this is like a uniquely British system that wants to impact public perceptions the world over, and is trying to drag not only British media outlets but also major tech platforms in the US into their censorship web, this is something they've been trying to do for many years. They are looking at how legislation in different countries can be exploited to further their interests and further censorship. I mean, it's a really quite extraordinary thing that that say X or the form would be subject to this quote unquote voluntary regime, which they actually kind of have to go along with. And I might add as well that it is repeatedly stated in the declassified documents that the DSMA is not concerned with information in the public domain. They don't seek to intervene and prevent journalists reporting on that, and then yet their own publicly available minutes show that they do this all the time. And there is, for instance, in April 2023, there was a DSMA meeting where it was discussed how a journalist was on the verge of publishing a story about British Army involvement on operations overseas. I suspect this was Ukraine, I'm not sure, but and it talks about the journalist complied with the DSMA's demands that they not report on this, but they pointed out that, well, all of this information is in the public domain. So I mean, it's a barefaced lie that they
Right.
don't concern themselves with open source information. And yeah, as I say, they are seeking to expand this in every direction, including to cover quote unquote disinformation, which is, I mean, that is like disturbing, because of course disinformation, like national security, is this completely meaningless, nebulous concept, which means anything that the British government decides is quote unquote disinformation.
When you were going through these documents, Kit, was there something that's made you stop and go, wow, it's even worse than we thought? I mean, I know you've seen a lot. You're an incredible journalist. You've seen a lot of dirty stuff in your time. But is there something you said, holy smokes, like this is what they were concerned about? This is what they were trying to get suppressed? It's even worse than we thought?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that as I mentioned, the series of logs about what was requests for suppression between 2011 and 2014. I mean, it had all manner of references to topics which have nothing to do with national security, including child sex abuse, the Metropolitan Police, that's London's police force, members of that being involved in downloading child pornography, and also the very vague and broad concept of Scottish independence. It's like there is this assumption that the DSMA can make demands of reporters on any conceivable topic. And that they will play ball, and they do 90% of the time. And I think that really jumped out, like how broad their purview is. I mean, it is well known and established that they focus on, or the DSMA focuses on matters related to the military and British intelligence. I mean, this is just so far out of any definition of national security. And there is a a rather opaque scandal that hasn't gotten very much, if any, mainstream media attention, and we can see why. There are several cases of individuals claiming that they were the victim of elite sex abuse rings. When they were children, that they were raped by prominent influential figures, including state officials, and the DSMA wants to crack down on this as well. That really jumped out, and it's like you've got to bear in mind, like since in the period since 2014, I mean that's over a decade now. I mean, how many sex scandals involving high-profile figures have been silenced or censored as a result of DSMA intervention?
That's crazy. And who would be directing this? Like, hey. Like, I get we don't want our special forces being outed. I get that piece of it, and you could sort of claim under national security that we don't want these individuals being hunted down, and the same that you would do with spies in other countries, et cetera. I understand that from a national security concern, but to protect members of parliament, to protect members of the police force, to protect high-profile elites who have nothing to do with national security because of their downloading of child porn or child sex trafficking or the abuse of children, like you're protecting these people? Who I want to know who the people are inside the DSMA or MI6 or MI5 or in the Ministry of Defense who are actually actively defending pedophiles.
Yeah, well, I mean, I mean, again, it goes back to this very broad notion of national security, and it's like, well, yeah, I mean, and this is something I've written about recently as well. But Prince Andrew, he has now been stripped of effectively excommunicated from the royal family, and been stripped of all of his titles. He can no longer refer to himself as a royal. you know, I would bet a vast amount of money that his sexual exploits, which were not a secret, and his relationship with Epstein were like subject to DSMA intervention, because written into the effective constitution of the British military, of MI5 and MI6, is defending Britain in the name of king and queen and country. Automatically anything that's harmful to Britain's reputation or kind of public relations image becomes of interest. As I say, I think that's what like really jumped out to me. It's just the extraordinarily broad array of targets, and since 2014, we've had the Epstein scandal, which clearly does extend all the way to Buckingham Palace. We've had numerous controversies involving parliamentarians and other prominent figures, current and former, emerge into the public domain, usually via foreign media, it must be said. And it's like, to give an example of the kind of devastating, the effective nature of the DSMA. When The Guardian in 2013 began reporting on Edward Snowden's disclosures about NSA and GCHQ spying, the entire British media, with the exception of The Guardian, didn't go near the story. This is like a global scandal which was covered in every corner of the world. And Britain uniquely was, for the most part, completely silent about it. As I say, this is why the DSMA wants to extend its tendrils, even further. It wants to infiltrate directly or indirectly newsrooms in the US, throughout the Five Eyes global spying network, but the West more generally. It's really quite extraordinary. And I might add as well that the fact that the DSMA was coordinating with Australian officials, it shows that they're keen to export this model overseas. And it's not the only censorship mechanism that the British state maintains. There is a British government body that's now called the National Security Online Information Team, which used to be called the Counter Disinformation Unit, it got this when it was still branded the CDU. It got busted for cracking down on "quote unquote" COVID disinformation, which is by definition this was an international event. And the CDU was pushing back against critics of lockdowns, of social distancing, of vaccine passports, of vaccine and mask mandates. Its scope was truly international in scale. And I mean, in respect of, say, like the proxy war in Ukraine, the CDU was also involved in tackling "quote unquote" disinformation around Bucha. Now, the ever mysterious Bucha incident, which this is now nearly 4 years ago, or it's like 3.5 years ago, we were told by British officials that the Russians were committing genocide, and that Bucha was a demonstration of this, by token of the Russians allegedly having massacred innocent, defenseless civilians in the town. Now, this was fundamental to keeping the war grinding on, and hitherto fruitful peace talks between Zelensky and Putin be sabotaged. And again, this has an international component. There were people, including US Defense Intelligence Agency officials at the time, who were saying, well, what happened in Bucha, even if it is true that Russians killed civilians, and this is ruining any chance of a negotiated settlement, pushing this false narrative in the public domain. And we fast forward to today, and the BBC refers to "quote unquote" alleged Russian atrocities in Bucha. So they are now admitting the serious questions hang over this event. There are a wide variety of, yes, international incidents referred to in the logs of requests and advice submitted and received. Events in France, like the mysterious 2012 assassination of the British Iraqi al-Hili family. This is again a story with it occurred in France. The al-Hilis were the head of their family was an individual who was involved in Iraqi chemical, biological, and nuclear research. That has an international implication, and the DSMA was preventing journalists from reporting on what happened. And we must ask ourselves, why, and also, yes, the impact this had more widely on how overseas media reported on this, still unsolved mass murder of a family in the French Alps. Right. It's very. It's something I think that people the world over need to be concerned about, because I think Britain is the kind of this core nucleus of online and indeed offline censorship, and it seeks to bring other countries into its fold.
Well, I think, and there's broad implications like continuing the war in Ukraine, of course. So the lies around Bucha. I mean, we were in deep trouble. We got banned on YouTube as when we were reporting about Bucha. So there was a concerted effort to keep that propaganda going. The maternity hospital story, they didn't like covering the truth about that in Ukraine. So I can only imagine this was part and parcel of keeping the war in Ukraine going, that machine going, of course. I would encourage our audience, deep dive this, go over to the Gray Zone, read Kit's incredible work on this. He's been doing some great work on this story for a long time, and the Britons, the censorship machine there. Glad to have an extremist on the show, Kit. Great to see you. Keep up the extremist work.
We must stick together, and it's like, I think that, the fact that you got banned from YouTube for critically reporting on Bucha, that was probably the British who were responsible. So maybe write a strongly worded letter to Downing Street on that one, Clayton. But thanks for having me on, my friend. God bless you.
Always. Thanks so much, Kit Klarenberg from the Gray Zone. Check it out. We'll have links to it in the description below. Thanks, Kit. Great to see you.